So, hello everyone who's here with us on this wonderful Friday morning. Oh, it's not Friday, it's Tuesday. Wishful thinking, I guess. I don't know. I don't know where that came from. But anyway, welcome. Good morning, everyone. My name is Markus Thiel. Most of you know me. I'm a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the Green School of International Public Affairs here at FIU, and I also direct the EU's Jean Monnet Center of Excellence here at FIU. And as part of our grant, that generally is focused on social inclusion and diversity, we organized this year's conference under the topic of reimagining and reforming European foreign policies. Now that's of course a big stretch in many ways, right? I'm not sure that we can actually reform European policies single-handedly, right? Most European policymakers cannot reform European policies single-handedly, but at least we want to think about how to make existing EU as well as European national foreign policies more inclusive, more participatory, and more socially just in a European regional level as well as on a global level. In an age where, as we heard yesterday by the Deputy EU Ambassador Michael Curtis, in an age that has more geopolitical pressures, that sees more geopolitical pressures, that sees a need to remilitarize a lot of the world, and that also in Europe, at least, where we see a swing to the right, the nationalist protectionist right. So there are certainly some productive, interesting tensions. And that today we have a whole day with 4 panels that really broadly try to debate various aspects of how to reimagine and possibly at least think about reforming European policies. The first one, and I'll introduce our wonderful panelists in a second, will focus on concepts and contexts. So let me just on context and concepts to introduce the ideas surrounding the idea of reimagining, decentering Eurocentric foreign policy, and so on and so on. The second panel at 11 a.m. is also very interesting, and we thank you particularly for the collaboration with the German consulate, which had the idea to focus on the idea of feminist foreign policies. And feminist foreign policy is a fairly novel approach in foreign policy making. Many European countries have subscribed to it, increasingly also other non-European countries, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and so on and so on. So we'll hear, if you're interested, from 11 to 12:30. And then after lunch at 2 p.m. we have a wonderful consular roundtable with 4 of our consul generals who will report their national points of view in terms of what they are doing in creating a more cohesive EU foreign policy. And at 3 p.m. we have also an interesting panel that focuses on specific issue areas that are really right now very topical, such as the environmental protection, dealing with refugees, and dealing with neighbors and candidate states. So really a great program. I encourage you to stick around throughout the day, and yes, I hope you enjoy it. That being said, I want to thank the European Commission, of course, to fund our activities, including our center, and it would have not been possible that event without the European Commission in Brussels. Particular thanks goes, of course, also to the School of International Public Affairs, to my right hand, Madame Catherine, Christine, I don't know what's up with me, I haven't had enough coffee. Christine Kali Sanchez, and then of course our student assistant. Thank you very much everyone for helping out, appreciate it. And last but certainly not least, our wonderful panelists here today. Professor Nora Fischer-Onar, Professor Jean Mouteba-Radier, and Professor Victor Uribe-Ura. Thank you. So, next we have Professor Jean Mouteba-Radier. Christine, can you just forward to your bio slide? I don't. Oh, yeah. Yeah, don't worry. Exactly. But in any case, Jean He's the professor of anthropology and African diaspora studies at FIU, and a very cherished colleague of ours and a constant supporter of the Eurocentric as well. He's the author of 3 books and the editor or co-editor of 4 other volumes. He has authored more than 80 articles and book chapters, and was from January 2002 to 2007 the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology. He's the founding director of the Observatory of Justice for Afro-Descendants in Latin America at FIU, and his most recent visiting scholar positions have been at la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador, Quito, the Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar in Quito as well, the University of Ghana in Ghana, the University of Cape Coast, and the University of Sheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, Senegal. He currently serves as the principal investigator of the National Science Foundation funded research project, a multifaceted examination of the application of ethno-racial law in contemporary multiculturalist Ecuador. Since 2021, in addition to all of this, he is the editor-in-chief of the journal Latin American and Caribbean Ethnic Studies. So thank you very much, Jean, for being willing to contribute your perspectives, which I think fit very nicely in this panel as well. And the floor is all yours for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. And I must begin by thanking Markus and Christine for inviting me to participate in this panel. Even though I was somewhat surprised by the invitation, since although I grew up in Belgium, I was born in the Congo at the end of the period called the Belgian Congo, the very end. And I grew up in Belgium, and I went to school in Belgium and France, the undergrad at the Université de Bruxelles and the Université de Paris. So yes, so I was born from a colonized Congolese woman and a colonial father, Belgium. So although I spent a lot of time in Belgium and in Europe, have a complex relationship with all of that, I do not consider myself a European, so that's why I was somewhat surprised. I didn't know, and Markus will remember, we had a conversation, and he then was able to explain to me what my contribution could be. And so, okay, so this will be my contribution. So the European projects of expansion in non-European lands corresponded to the period historians have called war capitalism. Centuries ago, Europeans traveled to directly acquire in their regions of production in Asia and Africa products they were until then purchasing from traveling traders. That endeavor, as we know, brought Europeans to what is called today the Americas. So one key point I must emphasize here is that all of these European expansions in non-European lands were grounded on the fundamental idea of European civilized superiority over non-European peoples, and on an ideological system that proclaims the existence of human races. Indeed, race was instrumental to European expansionist and imperialist ambitions, particularly the principle that races are in fact at different stages of evolution, with the so-called white race being obviously on top of all of the others, which gave Europeans, Europe being the space where whiteness is indigenous, both an advantage over the other races and a duty to help them move ahead faster toward greater levels of civilization. Christian religions, of course, contributed to their sense of racial superiority and pointed to their duties to help non-European peoples to see the light by bringing them to believe in the only true God there is, which is one Europeans venerate. To make a long story short, it is obvious and undeniable that European foreign policies developed through European imperialism and expansion in the rest of the world, informing and justifying such policies. That is how European white supremacy spread and has been enforced around all corners of the globe. And to make a big jump, that is how the global ordering of national spaces and peoples, their economies and politics got established. The global order. What is that? I don't need it. Yeah. Forgot where I was. Yes. So that is how the global ordering of national spaces and peoples, their economies and politics got established. The global order, as we know it, progressively took shape and is characterized by continued coloniality, result of a long trajectory grounded on the initial European supremacy that emerged out of European-led or European-provoked war capitalism. So, European supremacy is indeed white supremacy. And so the idea of Europe obviously preceded the creation of the European community, the ancestor of the European Union. And one can clearly see that idea of Europe at work in the colonial periods of both Latin America and colonial Africa, for example. All European colonies in Africa, for instance, tended to include in the same category of Europeans all nationals of other European countries. This is how in the Belgian Congo you have British, you have people coming from a variety of other countries. And this is how, for instance, in Latin American countries, in particular in the South Cone, you have immigration policies adopted in the 19th century, early 20th century, made to privilege the immigration of Europeans over immigration of people coming from other regions of the world. Okay, so yeah, beautiful work has been done on that. So the beginning of European foreign policies, obviously, were these colonial policies grounded on European white supremacy. The history of European policies towards the rest of the world developed in such an ideological context in which race was absolutely fundamental. One cannot understand European expansion without paying careful attention to the centrality of the notion of race. Okay? Today's international relations students hopefully will have read the book by Robert Vitalis, White World Order, Black Power Politics, The Birth of American International Relations, published in 2015, which examines the history of the discipline of international relations from the late 19th century to the 1960s. And the author of the book, Vitalis, reveals how central the so-called race problem was to IR and what its implications were for global affairs at various historical moments. Vitalis notes in the preface of the book that the first specialized journal of IR was called the Journal of Race Development in 1910, founded in 1910, which was renamed in 1919 the Journal of International Relations. Okay, so this visibilization of the concept of race is already revealing this preoccupation to eventually decenter Europe or at least disguise or hide, the particular order that was established with the expansion of Europeans outside of Europe. I'll end by how to decenter Europe, and so and as I say, white supremacy, European supremacy in global affairs and in international relations could consist in listening carefully to because this is something that this is a question. This is not a new question. So many fields of inquiry in the US, in the global North, in the global South, have engaged in that endeavor, and so this is suggested to look very carefully, very briefly, and rapidly three fields of inquiry, which are the settler colonial studies, the pluriversalist approaches in social sciences and the humanities, and decolonial studies. And so all of these approaches focus on understanding the processes and impact and ongoing effects of settler colonialism, particularly in regions where settlers have displaced indigenous people. It emphasizes the ongoing nature of settler colonialism, which is not a fact, but a process, a structure, an ongoing process, a not finished process. And it aims to challenge settler colonial ideologies and narratives and advocate for indigenous rights, sovereignty, and self-determination. Seeks to uncover and confront the legacies of colonization and promote reconciliation and justice for indigenous communities. All of these fields, so this was for settler colonial studies. The pluriversalist approach advocates for recognizing and valuing diverse worldviews, knowledge systems, and ways of being, particularly those marginalized by colonialism and globalization. Rejects universalist frameworks that impose a singular perspective or hierarchy of knowledge, instead embracing multiplicity and interconnectedness. Encourages dialogue and collaboration across different cultures, identities, and epistemology. Challenge dominant narratives of progress, development, and modernity, which often perpetuate inequalities, marginalization, and white supremacy. So, decolonial studies critically examines the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, particularly in the global south, and their impacts on societies, economies, and cultures. The decolonial studies interrogate systems of power, knowledge, and representation that sustain colonial structures and hierarchies, including racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. It emphasizes the impact of the importance of decolonizing both minds and institutions, challenging epistemological and ontological assumptions inherited from colonialism, and engage with indigenous and subaltern perspectives, seeking to amplify voices and knowledge systems marginalized by colonial modernity. So, all of that to say that I was, to finish, surprised that in European studies, it still appeared to be necessary to have a conference such as this one dedicated to see how we could decenter Europe, which is, there are so many in academia discourses and fields of inquiry that have been exploring for decades these issues that have been very preoccupied by engaging in such a route. And so my advice would be it's time that European policymakers eventually pay attention to these developments in academia, both in the global north, but also in Latin America and in Africa. I've had experience teaching in both regions, and these particularly, it's very interesting to see that some of these discourses developed first in Latin America and are now very much present in Africa. For instance, colonial studies, and it's surprising to see, for instance, I wanted to make reference to Sarkozy's discourse, in Dakar, or Macron discourse as well to the Africans at the beginning of his first term, and now the surprise that the reaction that these two discourses, these two speeches provoked in African academia has left traces in publications, and it is surprising. I mean, it is informative to see how surprised France has been with the loss of the creation of the Sahelian, because this is what these guys are doing. They are rejecting colonialism. France is looked at as this continuing colonial presence, and they have been pushed historical alliances and engagement in anti-colonial discourse. And so it's interesting to see what's happening in the field. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. No, I mean, we can talk later about you know, the problem that European studies has in kind of you know, processing the decolonial impulses, but as a sort of a political science, narrow institutionalist field, right? It was also very much sort of technical, pragmatist, rationalist, and for a long time closed off themselves. But now, for the last 5 years, it has become much more concerned to decenter European studies from, you know, all the Eurocentrism of hundreds of years, basically. Okay, thank you very much for your contribution. And then last but not least, we have another interesting perspective that's slightly more Latin American focused by our church colleague, Professor Victor Uribe. So he's a professor of history and law at Florida International University. He is the, oh, now we're here. Just a second. This seems to be a common issue with the speaker today. Okay, here. He's the author, editor, and co-editor of 5 books, including the award-winning Fatal Love, Spousal Murders, Law and Punishment in the Late Colonial Spanish Atlantic, although we won't talk about that. A companion to Latin American history, his most recent book, co-edited with Matthew Murrow, was just released in 2024 by Murrow. Uribe has published over 100 articles, book chapters, and book reviews in referent academic journals. He's a member of the International Scientific Advisory Board of the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory in Germany. His research has been supported by fellowships from the Fulbright Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Tinker Foundation, and so on and so on. Dr. Uribe teaches a wide range of courses on Latin American colonial modern history, as well as global history, and his expertise in comparative legal history is also reflected in graduate offerings such as Grineland Society in Latin America, Lancet Society in Latin America, and comparative history of state and society in Latin America. Other courses he has taught include Latin American history and Latin American civilization. He also works on contemporary legal issues, such as the judiciary, the inter-American legal system, and judicial reform, and served from 2006 to 2009 as chief of party of the multi-million justice reform initiative, the largest ever in Latin America, founded by USAID, to overhaul the criminal justice system in Colombia, and that by itself is quite a challenge. So with that being said, thank you very much, Victor, for being here and to give your talk on legacies of European colonialism, law, politics, and violence in Latin America.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I thank you, Markus Thiel, for the invitation, and Christine Kelly for all the logistics, and the students, of course, who have made this conference possible. I was as surprised as Jan was when I was invited, because I am not a Europeanist, other than being a Latin Americanist, which is being a Europeanist, since colonialism made Latin America what Latin America is today. But in any case, Markus convinced me to participate, and I hope what I have to say is somehow relevant. I am not totally sure. I am a historian of colonial and modern Latin America and the Caribbean, and my research has tended to concentrate, to gravitate towards issues having to do with legal history, the history of violence, and in particular, issues concerning constitutional law, criminal law, and so on and so forth. So that is where I'm coming from, and that might be the value of some of my remarks, if there is value after all. I'm going to talk about 3 aspects. One of them has to do with the legal heritage in the colonial heritage in the legal realm, in the legal field. The second has to do with the colonial heritage in the realm of politics. And the third one will have to do with the colonial heritage in the realm of violence and confrontation. What I am going to say briefly is that in the legal field, which also has to do with justice, the main heritage that we draw from European colonialism over 300, sometimes as many as 400 centuries of European colonialism, is the presence of what to as the civil law systems or civil law traditions, that are traditions characterized by thick legislation, by lots of constitutions, lots of laws, lots of regulations. This is something that is actually notable to this day in Latin American societies, and that has a number of implications. In terms of politics, I would say that the main heritage that we draw from European colonialism concerns the nature of states in the region, and I would say that they are overgrown states. We are state-centered societies to a large extent, although there are many paradoxes in that, because even though we are supposed to be overgrown states, the reality is that states are ineffective in many Latin American and Caribbean societies. And in terms of violence, I would say that what we'll have is closely connected to the injustice, to the inequality. Violence in Latin America, I would say, is endemic in many societies and in various modalities. We are talking about political violence, we are talking about common violence, we are talking about gender violence. These are really endemic manifestations of violence throughout Latin America, and I would say they are closely linked to the inequalities. And I was going to say the inequalities inherited from colonialism, but I would say that the story is a little more complex, because what we learn from research is that actually inequality in Latin America grew even more considerably in the post-colonial era than in the colonial era itself. So this is in a nutshell what I have to say. And I will try to walk you through a number of quick points that again are mostly telegraphic, because in a 15-minute presentation there is really no time for in-depth comments. I will be happy if we engage in the question and answer in the conversation about some of these aspects. So I was saying that one of the aspects that characterizes our legal systems is that we are buried, literally buried in Latin America in laws. We are buried in notary and court paper files, and we are also buried in formalism. Many of these, again, is an inheritance from what happened over 300 years of Spanish, Portuguese, and in the case of the Caribbean, non-Spanish, non-Portuguese presence, French presence, English presence, but my remarks are mainly applicable to the regions I know most, which are Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking regions. This, again, corresponds to the proliferation of constitutions, constitutional amendments, law, legal codes. You will see that this is really a national pastime in Latin America, producing legislation, producing constitutions, reforming the constitution, reforming laws, and thinking that everything can be solved through laws became kind of a cultural frame of mind and remains so to this day. And again, I would question whether this is entirely a colonial product, or if it is actually something that also has a lot to do with the post-colonial period. The 19th century was a period when this happened extensively. And again, here we're talking about quote-unquote post-colonial societies. But in any case, this is something that we live with these days. Then we have, in the judicial realm, a tradition of litigation, of trials that are based upon extensive written files, extensive written documents, to the point that many judicial systems in Latin America ended up collapsing over the 19th and early 20th century. And actually, an ongoing process in Latin America is dealing with the collapse of the judicial systems, because if you were a lawyer in Latin America or a litigant in Latin America, what you would find is that your case could pile up bundles and bundles and bundles of paper that became unmanageable. And that, again, remains the case to these days. Lengthy, written judicial processes and litigation, and eventually collapsed judicial systems that are now, again, one of the greatest challenges in Latin America. And finally, another aspect that has to do with this legal tradition is the presence of notaries in Latin America, which, if you are familiar with Latin America, are like semi-ministries. Notaries in Latin America are not like is the case in the US, places that operate in a garage or in a corner of a real estate office or in your office, because actually you probably are familiar with the fact that some of your secretaries are notaries. No, in Latin America, notaries are these kind of ministries where you go to find all kinds of documents that have to do with your civil status, with your property sales, with your probates, with testaments, with contracts, and these are humongous, and these are super, super important and super present in the day-to-day lives of Latin American individuals, Latin American families, Latin American businesses. So again, these type of transactions and the fact that they are also connected to a thick body of administrative laws and a thick body of bureaucracies that are extremely violent to your life, characterize Latin America to this day. Again, this is very schematic, but this is what I would say is important to keep in mind concerning the legal system. Then, as for politics, as I mentioned, we really come from a tradition of overgrown states that are unfortunately dysfunctional and ineffective, and that are characterized by a spoil system, meaning that it is terribly violent to control portions of the state for your livelihood, for the livelihood of many Latin Americans. We rely considerably on the state. We are dependent upon state institutions. We are state-centered societies. My sense is that Latin Americans grew more the states than the economies, that we are societies with, again, overgrown states and relatively undergrown markets. Then, funnily enough, or interestingly enough, the significance of states came along with the significance of politics in a multiplicity of ways. Politics actually became in Latin America a sort of carnival-like event, elections in Latin America, contrary to what you would say in the US, where sometimes you don't even know elections are happening. In Latin America, it's like a holiday, and it's a moment of celebration, and people take to the streets, and people celebrate what is happening, even though there isn't much to celebrate ultimately, because politics are also tied to endemic corruption and widespread patron-client relations. Actually, patron-client politics and patron-client relations are essential to the way Latin American political systems operate, because, again, it is through patron-client ties that Latin American societies manage political competitions, deliver political favors, public goods, jobs, services. It is terribly vital to control the spoils, to control the state, because chances are your job or the job of your family group or the job of your loved ones or the job of your group, whatever your group is, depends upon, again, being on top of the control of one portion of the state, whether at the local, the provincial, or the national level. And then, finally, something that is central to Latin American life, and that, once more, I question whether it is entirely a product of the colonial heritage, is intense political and interpersonal violence. In Latin American societies, I would say this is closely related to blatant socioeconomic inequality. And socioeconomic inequality unquestionably has colonial roots, but I would say again that it grew dramatically after the 1870s. Research indicates that inequality in Latin America wasn't that different in the first half of the 19th century from what it was in Europe or what it was in the US, and that it is after the 1870s that inequality really took off and became as dramatic as it is today. Today, there are probably 32% of Latin Americans who live under poverty. We are talking about 210 million people. There are about 13% of Latin Americans who live under extreme poverty. We're talking about 90 million people. And again, these figures, I think, connect directly to what happens on a day-to-day basis in terms of confrontation. Latin American societies became confrontational, I think, because it became clear to many Latin Americans that the only way to demand dignity and redress of the conditions under which they live is to take to the streets and to protest many times violently. So I'm afraid that again Latin Americans got used to be heard through force because they realized that sending memos and sending written petitions to authorities typically doesn't operate any major changes. So again, they became very mindful that if it was not by force, it would be unlikely anything would change. And then something that also became common in Latin America, I'm afraid, is the widespread presence of physical aggression over a number of issues. Politics is one of them, socio-economic inequalities is another one, racial inequalities and gender disputes. I am afraid Latin America today has some of the societies with the highest murder rate on earth. We are talking about places like Jamaica, where there are 60.4 homicides per 100,000 people, one of the highest murder rates on earth, then followed by Ecuador with about 44 homicides per 100,000 people, also a very impressive murder rate. And then the list goes on and includes places like Trinidad and Tobago, which we don't hear much about, but which has another impressive murder rate, as is the case in Haiti. I think Haiti is going to probably jump to the number one in the map. Today it is 40 murder rates per 100,000 people, but I think very soon it is going to surpass perhaps even Jamaica. I am afraid again, this is directly connected to some of the inequalities that the region needs to live with. And then I will conclude by summarizing that once more my points are we live through thick and formalistic legal, judicial and bureaucratic systems in Latin America. We live in a society, in a series of societies where statism, patron-client mechanisms are central, and we live in a society where inequality and chronic confrontation and violence is the day-to-day life of many Latin Americans. And I wanted to close by being a little propositive, because I knew it was a meeting where there would be perhaps European dignitaries. I don't know if they are here this morning, they might come later, but whenever they are here, I hope that the European dignitaries might consider, and I know they have already considered, a number of policy approaches that might make European foreign relations more inclusive and more constructive. One of them, I would say, how can European policy help some of this? I would say that these days, given the nature of what happens with legal and judicial systems in Latin America, information technology and connectivity is vital to Latin America. I think we still have long ways to go in that realm, and I think Europeans could play a constructive role there. Then I think transparency is also quite an important challenge in Latin America. Transparency in public contracting, in hiring, and I think that there is much to do with training software and observation of practices, contracting practices, hiring practices, particularly at the public level in Latin America. And I know that Europeans through NGOs and governments have done a fair amount of very constructive work with transparency-related activities. And finally, I would say obviously that social investment to increase productivity, reduce poverty and educational inequality, enhance access to justice, actually combat deforestation are all also important policies to keep in mind. Thank you very much.